Julian Carter only wanted to sell a rusted car to cover his late wife's hospital bills. But at an auction lot in Nevada, billionaire Madison Sinclair laughed out loud in front of the crowd the moment she saw his old dusty coupe. She called it a rolling pile of scrap metal and said it wasn't worth the price of a single battery pack. Everyone laughed. Julian said nothing. He quietly took his daughter's hand and walked away from the lot. 7 days later, that same car sold for $9 million and sent the entire investment world into a panic. If you have ever been judged by how little you had, this story will remind you that real value always finds its moment. The sun came down hard on the stretch of asphalt outside Julian Carter's one-bay garage on the east side of Tucson, Arizona. By July, the pavement shimmered with heat that no shade could soften, and Julian worked through it the way he worked through everything, with his head down, his hands moving, and his mind locked on the problem directly in front of him. His shop was small, the kind of place that smelled of rubber and motor oil no matter the season, with a dented metal shelf along one wall holding every socket wrench and diagnostic tool he owned. He took jobs most garages wouldn't bother with: cracked radiators on decade-old sedans, transmission wobbles on trucks held together more by habit than engineering, and he charged what the customers could actually afford. The neighborhood knew him, trusted him, and brought him cars that had no business running again. Julian always found a way. What the neighborhood did not know, what Julian never found reason to mention, was that he had once been something else entirely. Before the garage, before Tucson, he had spent 4 years working as a hybrid systems engineer at a mid-sized automotive firm in Michigan. He understood not just how engines ran, but why they ran, the interaction between electromagnetic coils and combustion rhythm, the precise tolerances that separated efficiency from breakdown. He had written internal technical reports that senior engineers plagiarized without credit and solved thermal management problems that 2 full teams had abandoned. But the company had collapsed under bad leadership and worse debt, and Julian had come back southwest with a young wife, a modest severance check, and plans they had drawn up on restaurant napkins. The plans had been good. Time had not been. Her name was Claire. She died from a fast-moving cancer 18 months after their daughter Grace was born, and the medical bills arrived in waves, each one larger than the last, each answered by Julian with whatever the garage brought in that month. He never fell entirely behind. He also never fully caught up. Grace, now 6 years old, spent her afternoons sitting on a folding chair near the open bay door, drawing pictures in a spiral notebook while her father worked. She drew the same thing over and over: sleek 2-door car parked in the back corner of the garage, partially hidden beneath a canvas tarp. She had never seen it run. She had never sat inside it. But she drew it from memory the way children draw things that feel important to them before they understand why. Julian had pushed that car into the garage on the day Claire came home from the hospital for the last time. Claire had ridden in it, not driven, just ridden, her hand resting on the window frame, her eyes on the open sky, and Julian had kept it ever since the way some people keep photographs or old letters, because getting rid of it had always felt like closing a door he wasn't ready to close. But the landlord had given him notice on the garage space. The last round of hospital billing had come out of collections with interest attached, and Grace needed school supplies, winter clothes, and a life that was not spent counting weeks. Julian stood in the back of the garage one evening with his hand resting on the canvas tarp and made the kind of decision that men make when love and practicality finally negotiate a painful truce. When he told Grace the next morning that he planned to take the car to an auction in Nevada, she looked at him with her mother's eyes and asked if he really had to. He pulled her close and promised her something he meant with every word, that he would only sell it to someone who actually understood what it was. Grace pressed her face against his shoulder and said nothing. She had learned early that her father meant what he said, and that sometimes meaning something did not stop it from hurting. The Lakeside Collectors Auction in Henderson, Nevada ran 3 days every spring and attracted everyone from weekend hobbyists to institutional buyers who flew in on private jets and barely touched the complimentary food. Julian loaded the coupe onto the flatbed tow truck he used for roadside recovery work, strapped it down with a care he gave to everything mechanical, and drove through the night to arrive at the registration lot by 7 in the morning. The car, even under daylight, looked like something pulled from a junkyard. The factory paint had oxidized to a chalky brown gray. The chrome trim had long since disappeared under corrosion, and the entire body wore a kind of dignified ruin that takes decades to achieve. Julian checked it in at the front desk, handed over the documentation folder, and watched the registration clerk glance at the vehicle and back at him with the flat expression of someone actively suppressing a comment. Sebastian Doyle ran the administrative side of the auction with the practiced friendliness of a man who had learned that charm was more efficient than honesty. He was broad-shouldered and silver-haired, dressed in a fitted jacket with a silk pocket square, and had built his reputation over 15 years on the careful cultivation of high-value sellers while quietly minimizing the influence of the low ones. When he saw Julian standing by the registration desk in a clean but worn flannel shirt, carrying a manila envelope of photocopied documents, Sebastian's assessment was immediate and ungenerous. He approached with a handshake that landed like a formality, guided Julian through a floor agreement that set an extremely low reserve price, and strongly implied that Julian ought to be grateful for the spot. Julian read the agreement carefully, asked one question about the exit clause, and signed without visible reaction. Sebastian interpreted the silence as compliance. The main event floor was organized by prestige, and Julian's coupe was assigned to a back corner near the emergency exit, between a 1970s pickup and a fiberglass kit car that had been poorly assembled. Staff members walked past it without slowing down. One of the younger handlers said something to a colleague that made both of them laugh. Julian set up a small folding chair beside the car, settled Grace into it with her notebook, and went to get them both something from the vendor carts outside. Grace sat quietly, one leg swinging, drawing the car from a new angle. Madison Sinclair arrived at 11:32 in the morning, and her arrival was the kind that could not be anything other than an event. 3 black SUVs pulled into the priority lot near the main entrance, and she stepped out of the middle one wearing a structured blazer and the focused expression that people develop when they spend enough years converting attention into leverage. She was 27, founder and chief executive of Meridian Capital, an electric vehicle and AI mobility investment fund that had, in the previous 3 years, reshaped the funding landscape for clean transportation startups across the country. She was in Henderson not to browse but to evaluate specifically, to assess a solid-state battery startup whose principal investor was also presenting at the auction. A camera crew from a financial media outlet followed her at a respectful distance. She was midway through the main floor when she turned down the back corridor and saw Julian's car. She stopped. Then she laughed, not a small or private laugh, but a full, head-tilted laugh that pulled the attention of everyone nearby. That, she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying cleanly across the concrete floor, belongs in a museum of failure. The camera crew adjusted their angle. Several buyers and staff members nearby smiled and nodded the way people do when someone powerful confirms what they were already thinking. Julian, returning from the vendor carts with 2 cups of lemonade, heard the laughter from 10 feet away. He handed Grace her cup, sat down in the folding chair beside her, and said nothing at all. Grace took his hand. Across the corridor, standing near the entrance to the secondary viewing hall, a lean older man in a plain gray coat stood very still and looked at the coupe with an expression that was different from everyone else's, not amused, not dismissive, but measuring. The financial media crew asked Madison Sinclair for a few words during a break between floor tours, and she delivered them with the precision of someone who had been interviewed enough times to treat language as a precision instrument. The future of transportation, she explained, belonged to those willing to abandon the past entirely, to stop looking backward at the mechanical sentimentality of combustion-era engineering and start building toward integration, toward software-defined mobility, toward vehicles that were more computer than car. The reporter nodded along. The camera held on her face. Behind the reporter's shoulder, barely in the frame, Julian stood with his arms folded, listening without expression, his daughter leaning against his side. Sebastian Doyle, sensing an opportunity to align himself with the room's most powerful energy, made an announcement over the floor PA system shortly after noon. He reminded attendees that the day's presentation order was finalized and that the evening's final lot, his phrasing careful, his tone delicately theatrical, would feature a submission from a roadside recovery operator. He did not say Julian's name. He did not need to. The description was enough to generate a low current of amusement through the professional buyers clustered near the premium display floor. One of them pulled out his phone and photographed the coupe from across the hall, and by early evening the image had moved through at least 4 different private industry channels, accumulating commentary ranging from dry irony to outright mockery. Julian never saw any of it. Grace did, on the phone of a young auction staff member who thought the exchange was harmless fun. She looked at the caption for a long moment, then handed the phone back without speaking. She already knew it wouldn't change anything her father had decided. Julian was loading their remaining gear back into the tow truck cab, preparing for the drive back to their motel a few miles east. When he paused, he had walked back past the coupe one final time, not out of sentiment, just the habit of checking mechanical things, and crouched near the open engine compartment he had propped up for the day's viewing. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the near-empty hall, something caught his eye. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't labeled. It was a small stamped marking pressed into the corner of the primary battery housing, partially obscured by years of surface corrosion. Julian had seen a marking like it exactly once before in his professional life, during a single technical briefing at his old firm's Michigan facility, a briefing presented by an outside consultant and then abruptly canceled, its materials recalled, its follow-up session never rescheduled. He had been 23 years old at the time. He had not thought about that briefing in 4 years. He stood up slowly, closed the hood with a soft click, and looked at the car from the outside with entirely different eyes. The rust was real. The neglect was real. But something else was real too, something he had been too caught in grief and survival to notice when he first acquired the car, something that had been sitting in the back corner of his garage for 2 years and 6 months without him, once looking at it the way an engineer looks at a thing. Grace was waiting in the truck. Julian walked back to join her, buckled his seatbelt, and started the engine. He did not tell Grace what he was thinking. But on the drive back to the motel, he made 2 phone calls, both to former colleagues from the Michigan years. Both left as voicemails, and he spoke the same word into both of them, the name of a project that had been buried quietly, years ago, under a pile of corporate decisions that no one had ever fully explained. Back in Tucson, Julian waited 2 days before he touched the car again. On the 3rd morning, before Grace was awake, he pulled the canvas tarp off entirely, rolled it into a corner, and positioned 2 shop lights directly over the engine bay. He worked methodically, without shortcuts, beginning at the point he already understood and moving outward from there. He unbolted the primary battery housing cover and set it on the workbench. He traced the wiring harness from its origin to its terminations. He pulled the thermal management unit and turned it over under the light. What he found, over the course of 8 hours, rearranged something fundamental in his understanding of what he had been living next to for more than 2 years. The car was not simply old. It was not simply neglected. Beneath the oxidized skin and the worn interior fabric and the silent, unresponsive exterior was a propulsion system that Julian's engineering training recognized as extraordinary and, more significantly, as unrecognized. The hybrid powertrain configuration had been built using a cell chemistry that, to his knowledge, had never been commercially produced. It handled thermal load in a way that standard lithium systems simply could not replicate, distributing heat across a matrix of microchannels that Julian had never seen outside a research document. The software architecture embedded in the control unit used a predictive charge allocation protocol, a method that, if applied to current generation battery systems, could realistically reduce operating heat loss by somewhere between 35 and 42%. Julian ran the numbers 3 times. Each time, the numbers held. Grace woke up at 6:30, padded into the garage in her socks, and found her father sitting on an overturned plastic bucket staring at the open engine bay with the look he sometimes got when something wasn't adding up the way it should. She brought him a glass of water and sat down beside the car on the floor, leaning against the front wheel. Julian explained what he was looking at, the simplified vocabulary he used when he wanted her to actually understand something rather than just hear a version of it. He told her the car had an engine that was different from other engines, that someone had built something a long time ago that was ahead of everything else, and that for some reason, nobody had ever told anyone. Grace looked at the engine for a moment, then back at her father. "Is it like a secret?" she asked. Julian considered this. "Something like that," he said. The documentation folder that had come with the car contained very little of value on its face. Registration papers that ended in the early 2000s, a hand-typed service record that stopped mid-page, and a single photograph of the car new, parked in front of a building whose signage had been removed before the picture was taken. Julian had dismissed the folder long ago as legally necessary but informationally empty. Now he went through it again, sheet by sheet, with a flashlight and a legal pad. On the back of the photograph, in faint pencil, he found a serial number. It took him 40 minutes of cross-referencing through old industry technical documents he had archived digitally from his engineering years to find a match. The serial number corresponded to a prototype designation that appeared in a single footnote in a publicly available federal regulatory filing from nearly 21 years ago, and then never appeared anywhere again. The filing referenced a hybrid powertrain development program that had been discontinued due to commercial irrelevance. The name of the overseeing corporation had been redacted. The name of the lead engineer had been redacted too. But someone had cared enough to bury the paper trail rather than simply lose it. And that care, Julian understood, was itself a form of evidence. He locked the garage, checked the windows, and called Grace in for dinner. He did not sleep well that night. Twice in the dark hours he thought he heard gravel shifting in the narrow alley beside the shop. The first name on Julian's list of former colleagues had moved to Oregon and was running a home renovation business. The second was in consulting and responded quickly, but only to say that he wasn't in a position to discuss certain topics on a recorded line, and perhaps Julian should think carefully about what he was sitting on before he talked to anyone else. The third name, a woman named Patricia Norris, who had been the most technically skilled battery chemist Julian had known during his Michigan years, didn't respond to the first voicemail or the second. On the third day, she called from a number Julian didn't recognize. She spoke for about 4 minutes. She told him that the project had been buried for reasons that went beyond simple commercial failure, that there had been parties with significant financial motivation to ensure the technology never reached the market, and that the engineer who created the system, a man named Raymond Ward, had left the industry entirely and had not been heard from professionally in over a decade. She ended the call by saying 3 words Julian would think about for the next 48 hours: "Don't sell yet." Madison Sinclair's research team, meanwhile, had been following a completely separate thread. A data analyst on her staff had flagged a reference in a secondary source, a hobbyist deep dive article about discontinued hybrid programs of the early 2000s that referenced a prototype vehicle whose technical specifications matched, in partial but provocative detail, a theoretical energy density profile that Meridian Capital's own battery team had been trying to reverse engineer for months. Madison read the flag, cross-referenced it with her own sourcing, and issued a quiet directive to locate the physical vehicle. She did not yet know that the vehicle was sitting in a garage in Tucson under the care of the man she had publicly laughed at 6 days before. Sebastian Doyle knew more than he revealed to either party. He had made his reputation partly on exactly this kind of information asymmetry, knowing who was looking for what before either buyer or seller understood the full picture, and positioning himself at the center of the transaction. He had reached out to Julian 3 times since the Henderson auction, each time with an offer that dressed itself as generosity while systematically lowballing the actual market signal. Julian returned none of the calls. Sebastian interpreted this as confusion, and confusion, in his experience, resolved itself into compliance faster than most people realized. On a Thursday evening, Julian returned to the garage after picking Grace up from her after-school program and found the side door slightly ajar. He was certain he had locked it. Nothing was visibly missing, not his tools, not his equipment, not the laptop he kept in the desk drawer. But the documentation folder had been moved from the filing cabinet to the workbench. It hadn't fallen. It had been placed. Julian stood in the center of the garage for a long moment, listening. Grace, unaware of any of this, was in the back office area pulling homework from her backpack. Julian locked the door from inside, pushed the car into the corner nearest the wall, and covered it with 2 tarps instead of 1. That night he sent a message to Patricia Norris using a secure app she had suggested he download during their phone call. He wrote 3 sentences. She responded in under 2 minutes. The following morning, a small envelope appeared under the garage's front door. It contained a plain white card with no logo, no phone number, no email address. It read only, Thursday, 7 p.m. The Copper Rail Diner on Route 40. Under the text, in small handwriting, were 2 initials, J. H. Madison Sinclair had not built Meridian Capital by being slow to recognize when she had made a material error. She had also not built it by being comfortable with that recognition. When her research analyst delivered the full technical summary of the Henderson Coup's suspected origin, a 20-slide internal brief prepared over 48 hours with sourcing from 3 independent automotive historians and 1 former regulatory consultant, Madison read it in a single sitting, said nothing for several minutes, and then asked for the room to be cleared. What the brief described was not simply a valuable collector's item or a strategically significant prototype. It described a vehicle whose core battery architecture, if intact and technically documented, represented a foundational advance in energy density management that predated the current generation of solid-state battery research by nearly 2 decades. Whoever had built it had been right, extraordinarily right, at a time when the market had not been prepared to agree. And Madison had stood in a public venue in front of a media crew and laughed at it. She instructed her director of acquisitions to locate the owner immediately. The director returned 2 hours later with the name Julian Carter, a Tucson address, and a note that this was the same man from Henderson. Madison closed her laptop, stood at her office window for a moment, and then did something she very rarely did. She drove out herself. Without a team, she arrived at the garage on a Tuesday afternoon, knocked on the frame of the open bay door, and found Julian underneath a pickup truck working on a fuel line. He rolled out, looked up at her, recognized her immediately, and said nothing. She introduced herself formally, which he didn't need, and asked if they could speak. Julian said he was in the middle of a job. She said she could wait. He said that was her choice, returned to the truck, and finished the fuel line. Grace was in the back office with her homework, and at some point during the next 20 minutes she appeared in the doorway between the office and the garage floor, looked at Madison standing near the bay door, and said with the directness that 6-year-olds deploy before they learn to moderate it, "You're the one who laughed at the car." Madison looked at the child, then at the floor. "I was," she said. Grace considered this for a moment. "My dad doesn't like people who laugh at other people," she said. Madison didn't have an answer for that. When Julian finally came out from under the truck, washed his hands, and turned to face her, Madison offered an opening figure that was, by most standards, an extremely generous acquisition price. Julian listened to the entire offer without interrupting. Then he told her politely that he wasn't ready to sell. Madison, whose professional life had accustomed her to yes and no but not to this particular quality of quiet, wasn't certain how to continue. She tried once more, adjusting the framing, referencing the technology's potential, implying a partnership structure rather than a pure sale. Julian let her finish. Then he said, "What you're describing, the value, the impact, the market potential, you understood all of that the moment you walked in here today. You had the full picture. At the auction, you had a fraction of it and used it to get a laugh. That's not a mistake I want to reward." He said it without anger, without performance, and without the hesitation that might have softened it. Madison drove back to her hotel in silence. She had been told her entire professional life that her greatest asset was the ability to assess value quickly and move before others could. She understood, on the drive back, that this ability had a failure mode she had never fully examined. It worked beautifully when the value was visible. It failed entirely when the value was quiet. Word moves through closed circles faster than it moves through open ones. By the second week after Henderson, the prototype designation that Julian had traced through the federal filing footnote was circulating through collector networks in 3 countries, carried by exactly the kind of informal, unattributable communication that serious collectors use to protect the advantages of early knowledge. An acquisitions representative from a Tokyo-based automotive heritage organization made contact through a third party and offered $50,000 without having seen the vehicle. 4 days later, a different approach came through a Stuttgart legal firm representing a European industrial group, this one at $300,000. Julian reviewed each communication carefully, consulted once with Patricia Norris by phone, and declined both. A week after that, an independent broker connected to a Gulf region sovereign investment fund submitted an offer at $1,200,000. Julian declined this one as well. Sebastian Doyle, watching these bids escalate through his industry contacts, understood that he had profoundly misjudged what was sitting in that back corner of the Henderson auction floor. He responded not with humility but with strategy. He contacted 2 automotive media journalists and fed them information suggesting the provenance of the Carter vehicle was questionable, that the documentation was incomplete, that the serial number might be a retrospective addition, that the prototype designation might refer to an entirely different unit. Both journalists ran preliminary queries. Neither found enough to publish. But the rumor, once released, did what rumors are designed to do in small markets. It created just enough uncertainty to make cautious buyers pause. Sebastian followed the planted doubt with a direct call to Julian, this time offering to serve as his exclusive sales representative at a commission that would have entitled Sebastian to more than a third of any final sale price. Julian did not pick up the phone. In the garage, with the tarp back and both shop lights angled over the engine compartment, Julian worked on the coupe the way a physician works on a patient they have a deep personal reason to help. He cleaned the thermal management unit without removing it, tracing each microchannel with a dental pick and compressed air. He addressed the surface corrosion on the cell casing with the kind of chemical care that left the original manufacturing marks fully legible. He replaced the corroded terminal leads with matched replacements sourced from a specialty supplier in New Mexico, staying as close to original specification as the existing market allowed. And then, on a Thursday evening with Grace sitting on an upturned bucket 2 feet away holding the secondary work light, he connected the charge inputs, stepped back, and pressed the ignition switch he had carefully reseated in its housing. The engine started, not with a cough or a struggle. It started the way well-made things start when they are ready, clean, immediate, and with a harmonic quality in its idle that both Julian and Grace heard and registered without speaking. Grace looked at the engine, then at her father, and gave a small, unedited smile. Julian crouched to check the temperature readings and cell balance indicators, both of which responded within acceptable parameters. The system was alive. After more than 2 decades of dormancy, the drive configuration was operational. That same evening, Julian found a note slipped under the garage door while they were working. A different note than the first, this one on folded paper rather than a card. It said, "I know what it is. I know who built it. I know what they did to make sure no one would find it. You are the only person with a copy of the original hardware. Meet me Thursday. Joseph Hale." The garage space lease had been in arrears since March, and by mid-April the property management company sent Julian a formal notice of termination with 30 days attached. He had known it was coming, managing the knowledge the way he managed most difficult information, by working around it methodically while keeping it visible in his peripheral awareness. The notice moved it from peripheral to central. He did the math with a legal pad and pencil and arrived at a number that was honest and unpleasant. The garage leaseback payment, the outstanding hospital billing account that had recently transferred to a secondary collections firm, the school enrollment fee for Grace's next year, and 3 months of operational costs totaled up. The sum represented more money than Julian had any clear path to in the present. The offer from the corporate entity arrived through a law firm the following day. It was structured as a private acquisition at $2 million, with a 48-hour window for acceptance and a confidentiality clause that would have prevented Julian from disclosing the existence of the vehicle or its technology to any third party. The law firm's cover letter described the offer as generous given the uncertainty surrounding the vehicle's documented history, a phrasing Julian recognized immediately as a reference to Sebastian's planted doubt narrative. $2 million was more money than Julian had ever held in a single account. It was not, he now understood, close to what the car was actually worth. He sat with the offer for a full evening. Grace was asleep. The garage was quiet. He had the legal pad in front of him and the envelope from the law firm beside it, and he sat at the desk with the single lamp on and thought about what it would mean to take the money, the immediate relief of it, the clean resolution of every debt, the ability to move into a better space and give Grace a more stable situation. He thought about this clearly and without sentimentality. Then he thought about Claire. He remembered something she had said to him 2 months before she died, during a conversation about his decision to leave the Michigan job rather than fight the restructuring. She had been exasperated with him, not with the decision, but with the reasoning he was using to justify it. She had told him, "You keep deciding what you're worth based on what's easiest for other people to agree to. Stop that." He hadn't forgotten the sentence. He had just, in the years of survival that followed, found it hard to apply. Grace appeared in the doorway of the back room at midnight in her pajamas, holding her spiral notebook, her hair uncombed. She looked at her father at the desk with the legal pad and the envelope, and she said, "If Mom was here, what would she want you to do?" Julian looked at his daughter for a long moment. He folded the law firm's letter back into its envelope. "Go back to sleep," he told her. "I've got it figured out." Sebastian Doyle made one final move the following morning. He had quietly arranged for a pair of independent automotive contractors, men who owed him professional favors, to appear at a scheduled technical inspection Julian had organized with a legitimate appraisal firm. They were there to introduce enough technical ambiguity to justify a reduction in the vehicle's assessed value. They arrived at the garage at 9 in the morning. At 9:07, before they had spoken more than 2 sentences, a town car pulled into the lot outside, and a lean older man in a plain gray coat climbed out and walked to the garage door. He looked at the 2 contractors, then at Julian, with the patience of someone who doesn't need to explain himself. Sebastian's contractors, who recognized Joseph Hale's face from an entirely different level of the collector world than they normally operated in, excused themselves and left within 4 minutes. The Nevada Collector Vehicle Congress was scheduled for a Saturday in late April, and the organizers, who had initially dismissed the suggestion that the Carter Coupe be included as a featured lot, reversed their position after Joseph Hale made 2 phone calls on Julian's behalf. Hale made clear, in terms that were brief and not repeated, that the event would be significantly poorer without the opportunity to present what he described as the most consequential automotive prototype to have survived intact from the past 30 years. By Wednesday, the event's media outreach team had distributed a single-paragraph press advisory that named neither the vehicle's provenance nor its owner, but referenced an unprecedented discovery in hybrid propulsion history. By Friday evening, a national financial news network had sent a production team. 2 major automotive heritage publications had registered for press credentials. The number of registered bidders had nearly doubled. Julian drove the coupe to Henderson on Friday morning on a flatbed, as he had before. He drove the same route. He stopped at the same rest area outside Las Vegas where he and Grace had stopped the first time. Grace ate half a sandwich and spent the rest of the stop leaning against the truck's front wheel, looking at the covered flatbed. She was quieter than usual. Julian asked her what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about whether the car would end up somewhere good. Julian told her that was exactly the right thing to think about. The main event floor at the Congress was configured differently from the spring auction, larger, with elevated lighting rigs, a professional sound system, and tiered seating for registered observers. The Carter Coupe had been assigned the central display position. Someone on the logistics team had angled the lights so that the coupe's body caught them from a 45-degree angle that, oddly, made the surface patina of age and corrosion appear distinguished rather than degraded. Julian stood beside the car and watched people stop and look at it. Really look at it, in a way that had not happened in Henderson. He felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but occupied the same general neighborhood. Madison Sinclair walked in with a single assistant, no media team. She was dressed plainly by her own standards. She looked at the coupe from across the floor for a long moment before approaching, and when she reached Julian she said only, "I should have looked more carefully." Julian nodded. He didn't say anything else. Grace, sitting near the front of the display area with her notebook, watched the exchange and then went back to drawing. Sebastian Doyle attempted to position himself near the auctioneer's podium when the session opened but was intercepted by the event director, who had received documentation from a legal representative connected to Joseph Hale's network that outlined Sebastian's role in the false provenance campaign and the attempted disruption of the independent appraisal. Sebastian was escorted to an administrative office to discuss the matter and was not present for the auction. Several people in the room noted his absence and understood what it meant. Joseph Hale gave an 8-minute presentation from the podium before bidding opened. He was not a man accustomed to public speaking in the performative sense, but he was extremely accustomed to precision, and his presentation had the quality of something constructed from primary research over a very long time. He explained the vehicle's origin, a hybrid powertrain development program operating under federal research oversight in the early 2000s, whose lead engineer, Raymond Ward, had developed a thermal and charge architecture that was, in Hale's assessment, approximately 2 decades ahead of the commercially viable technology of its era. He explained the program's abrupt discontinuation, the removal of most physical records, and the survival of this single prototype unit. He named no corporate parties directly but made it very clear that the discontinuation had not been driven by technical failure. The room was completely silent when he finished. Bidding opened at $500,000. It reached $1 million in under 90 seconds. At $3 million, the room's energy changed. The casual observers and press people leaned forward, and the registered bidders who had come out of professional obligation, rather than genuine intention, quietly stopped raising their paddles. At $5 million, 6 active bidders remained. Madison Sinclair raised her paddle at $5,200,000, and she raised it again at $6 million. And Julian, standing at the side of the room with Grace's hand in his, watched her face and understood that she was bidding not primarily out of strategy, but out of something she needed to resolve for herself. A European bidder pushed to 7,800,000, and the room went very still, and then to 8 million, and the still deepened. Madison withdrew at 8,100,000 with an expression that was composed but clearly in some form of pain. Joseph Hale, standing near the back of the room, raised his hand. 9 million, he said. The auctioneer called it once, then again. The room did not breathe. The gavel came down. Grace looked up at her father. Julian looked straight ahead at the car under the lights, rust and silence and 20 years of buried truth, and he exhaled slowly. After the formalities were processed and the press photographers had their images, Joseph Hale found Julian in a side corridor near the exit and asked if he had a few minutes. Julian said yes. Grace sat on a bench outside the corridor door, her notebook on her lap, drawing something she had started during the bidding. Hale sat down across from Julian in a pair of metal folding chairs and spoke quietly, with the unhurried manner of someone who has arrived at a particular conversation after a very long time. He explained the full history of the prototype program, including elements Julian had not been able to trace from public documents. The program had been on the verge of a breakthrough that would have disrupted the existing battery supply chain significantly enough to threaten the near-term commercial viability of several large existing players in the energy and automotive sector. A coordinated effort across 3 corporate entities had resulted in the program's quiet termination, the effective disappearance of its lead engineer, and the disappearance of all but one physical prototype. That prototype had moved through several hands after the program's end, most owners unaware of what they had, and eventually came to rest in a parts lot sold to a retired Phoenix area dealer, who sold the lot to Julian's late wife, who had handled most of the estate and parts purchases that year. From there it had come to rest in the back of a one-bay garage in Tucson, under a canvas tarp, beside a folding chair and a child's spiral notebook. Hale paused. Then he said the man who authorized the original shutdown was Arthur Sinclair. Julian was quiet. He had been in a room for the past 2 hours with a woman named Madison Sinclair who had bid 6 times on a car whose destruction her father had funded. He let the information settle without expression. He understood that Hale was giving him a choice, not just a fact that the information was real. It was documented, and it could move through a legal or journalistic channel and land with significant force on Madison Sinclair's name, her fund, and the public identity she had built on the premise of building better futures through better technology. The irony was not subtle. Julian looked at the corridor door, behind which Grace was sitting with her notebook. He thought about Grace watching the moment he chose whether to use a piece of information as a weapon. He thought about what it would feel like to win in that particular way, and found that it had no weight he wanted to carry. He told Hale that the history of the program was important and should be documented and eventually made available to the appropriate archival and engineering institutions, but that he had no interest in directing it toward any particular individual. When Madison Sinclair passed the corridor 10 minutes later and saw Julian and Hale in the folding chairs, she stepped in and sat on the bench beside Grace without asking. Grace looked up at her, then back at her drawing, then back up again. "You didn't win," Grace said. Madison said no. A pause settled between them. "That's okay," Grace said. Madison looked at the notebook, at the drawing Grace had been making during the bidding, a front-angle view of the coupe under the auction lights, not rusted or ruined but simply and exactly what it was. Madison pressed her fingers to her eyes briefly. When she lowered her hands, she was not quite crying, but very close. "I think I've been wrong about a lot of things," she said, mostly to herself. Grace looked up at her with the calm certainty of a child who has understood something before the adults around her have. "My dad says being wrong is okay," she said, "as long as you figure out what's right." Julian Carter signed the lease on a new garage space in North Tucson 3 weeks after the sale. It was 3 times the size of the old shop, positioned on a corner lot with good light and room for a proper lift system. He paid the full deposit in a single transaction for the first time in his adult professional life. He settled the hospital accounts entirely, the original balances, the accumulated interest, the collections fees, and he never mentioned the amount to anyone. He arranged with a contractor to divide the back section of the new garage into a proper workspace for Grace, a real desk and shelving, with a window that caught afternoon light. Grace moved her drawings in on the first day and organized them into a grid that covered most of the wall space above the desk. In the center of the grid, she left a blank space the shape and size of the canvas she was planning to fill last. Madison Sinclair reorganized the investment criteria at Meridian Capital over the following 6 months. She did not announce it as a philosophical change, but her board and analysts noticed the shift. She began approving funding to smaller operations, individual engineers working in converted commercial spaces and home labs, projects that did not have presentation-ready pitch materials or professional advisory boards, but had the kind of technical credibility that rewarded careful, patient evaluation. She also began a quiet research effort, separately funded, to locate Raymond Ward, the engineer whose work had been buried in the early 2000s. By October, a member of her team found him. He was living in rural Vermont and had spent the last decade doing woodworking and occasionally consulting by email for graduate research students he had never met in person. Madison did not represent this connection to anyone as redemption. She knew it wasn't that. It was simply the beginning of something that should have started a long time ago. Sebastian Doyle did not survive the year professionally intact. The event director's documentation from Henderson connected him to both the false provenance campaign and the disrupted appraisal, and a subsequent industry review uncovered 3 additional instances of similar manipulation over the previous 7 years. His auction license was suspended pending a formal hearing. 2 of the institutional clients he had cultivated most carefully terminated their representation agreements within a week of each other. He did not contest the findings publicly. Joseph Hale donated the coupe to the National Automotive Heritage Collection in Dearborn, Michigan, where it was installed in a dedicated exhibit about the history of hybrid propulsion development in America. The interpretive panel beside the car contained a full technical description of the drive architecture and its significance, the history of the program's suppression, and the story of the car's survival and recovery. The acknowledgement panel at the bottom listed 2 names, Raymond Ward, lead engineer, and Julian Carter, custodian. On the first Saturday of May, Julian drove Grace up to Dearborn to see the exhibit. They walked through it together, and Grace read every panel, all of it, including the technical sections, moving her lips slightly for the harder words and stopping to ask her father questions whenever she hit something she wanted to understand. When they reached the car, she stood in front of it for a long time. The coupe was cleaned and stabilized but unrestored, presented as it had been found, surface corrosion, worn trim, the quiet accumulated evidence of a long time spent waiting. Grace reached out and touched the glass of the display case lightly, just once, the way you touch something that belongs to history. On the drive home, Grace asked, "Do you miss it, Dad, Warren?" Julian thought about the question for a while, as he thought about most things, honestly and without rushing. "No," he said finally. "I'm glad it's where people can see what it was." Grace leaned against the door and watched the highway signs go by. "What about Mom's car?" she asked quietly. Julian reached over and took her hand. "The thing I needed most from that car," he said, "is already in this truck with me." The highway opened ahead of them, wide and lit by the low angle of a May evening sun, and they drove south into it together, not chasing anything, not leaving anything behind, just moving forward the way people do when they finally have enough room to breathe.